Greetings and salutations, all you gorgeous individuals. Welcome inside. It is another epi of League Unlocked. My name is Eric, flying a little Han Solo on today's epi for a rare episode where we are highlighting, praising the West, both EU and NA. What? There's positives? There's good moments in their history? Well, yes. Maybe a smaller pool to pull from than the LCK or LPL, but today we are looking at the best international performances from both EU and NA, because we know whenever international events roll around, all of a sudden we have a handshake camaraderie of hopefully, maybe, possibly getting some upsets against the LCK and LPL. So united in rivalry and brotherhood are we internationally. And before we get to the main seven, I actually want to talk about some bubble performances that were at least good and you were leaving proud of that team at an event. And you can go as recently as 2024 G2 at Worlds, because they had the most insane draw that you could probably draw up in this Swiss stage, going up against BLG, T1. They beat Weibo, ended up playing 3 of the 4 semi-finalists at the 2024 World Championship. So even though they didn't make top 8, you were proud of them. TSM, I know they shouldn't be anywhere near this list, but 2016, even though they, again, did not get out of groups, they were in that group of death. They got wins against both Samsung and RNG, and you maybe even should have had 2 wins against Samsung, and then you're probably getting through out of groups. But still, a solid performance where you were less disappointed by far than 2017 TSM. The 2017 star from EU you could talk about was Misfits, who stole that spot in top 8 from TSM and proceeded to go toe-to-toe 5 games against SKT, again restoring faith in EU and the West, competing against then the best team at the world that most people were still thinking. And then we go even a few years back from that, Cloud9 at 2014 Worlds. This is when they get out of groups, they beat Najin's Shield, they've beaten Alliance, who were the top team from EU. They go head-to-head against Samsung Blue, who were obviously the two-headed titans between them and Samsung White, favorites for the whole event. Yes, they lose, but this was like, 10 years before everyone was screaming that you have to play your own style against the top-seeded or the best teams from the LCK and LPL. That's what Cloud9 was doing in 2014. And it almost, so close, got them a Game 5 against one of the best teams from Korea. But those are just the bubble guys that we're not quite talking about, that you felt good about, but maybe not great about. So who did we feel great about? If you're looking at individual series, this probably remains the biggest upset in Western history, and this is 2019 Team Liquid at the Midseason Invitational. Now, when we're doing these best performances, we're kind of looking at the entire tournament as a whole. So we're including a group stage that saw Team Liquid, maybe struggle against SKT and IG, beat G2, handled their business against the Fong Blue Buffalo, but ultimately it all comes down to that series against Invictus Gaming, who were the defending champions, who went 9-1 in groups, who were fresh off of a 3-0 shellacking in the spring finals over in the LPL. They were hands down consensus the best team on the planet at the time, and Team Liquid doesn't even need a Game 5 to take them down. This is maybe even when the Shy was even more terrifying than that 2018 World Championship was early on in 2019. So Team Liquid, fresh off of, this is basically the same, this is when Core JJ came in. The year before at MSI, they had the Olay debacle, and they disappointed, were not able to get out of groups, losing a tiebreaker to Fnatic at the time. But 2019 was the incredible bounce back resurgence for Team Liquid, and really the main reason we don't have them higher on a list like this is, well, that tournament run ended by them getting completely smashed, the fastest international best of 5 finals ever at the hands of G2. So even if they made it a little bit competitive in that NA versus EU finals, then maybe you could have TL a little bit higher on this list. But not the case, but still deserving of all the accolades and still probably remains the biggest individual series upset that we have ever seen. For sure at MSI, but maybe even when you include Worlds. One of the OG earlier days, well, the early day organization from EU that competed with the best of the best was Fnatic, and we are going to 2015. That World Championship that saw them have the perfect 18-0 regular season in the summer split. They were tested by Origin in the playoffs, had to go to 5 games, but ended up back-to-back split titles. And this was, the first time since Korea actually started taking the game seriously and was at the forefront of these events that you thought a Western team, specifically a European team, could go toe-to-toe with the very best of the world. And after a bit of a slow start, we saw the week 2 level up as they proceeded to stomp Cloud9. They have this infamous Huni quadra kill where Freak's voice is cracking that he does on the Riven, and they proceed to kind of dumpster EDG in quarterfinals 3-0. Clean sweep. Reckless is playing AD Kennen, and then we have the European eulogy that ends up happening as SKT goes against Origin. The Coup Tigers go against Fnatic in those semifinals. And on paper, it looks like Fnatic, they just got 3-0, business as usual. They were not even close to the same level as the Coup Tigers, but it was actually a competitive series. Games 1 and 2, Fnatic had decent sized leads, especially in the early game. Just a few mistakes and they weren't able to close it out. But it's a classic case of that series was closer than a 3-0 on the scoreboard dictates. And you combine that with, again, the level of expectation that this team had, especially when you're combining what they did at MSI, also going toe-to-toe against SKT, but lived up to the hype, I think, Fnatic, even though they bowed out in the semifinals. That version of Fnatic, what people were expecting, the levels that we were getting out of the Coup Tigers and SKT, should have been more than proud of the boys in black and gold and what they did at the 2015 World Championship. And one more honorable shout out for Origin, because they played second fiddle to Fnatic all year, all split. They were only there for one split. They went from challengers to top 4 at the World Championship in a single year. And in terms of expectations, they were not nearly the same as Fnatic. So you could honestly slot Origin alongside this Fnatic run because of that LGD, KT, TSM death group that they somehow managed to get out of. And then maybe got a lucky draw with Flash Wolves in quarterfinals, but still made it to semifinals, overperforming all expectations that they did have. Number 5 squad on this list to chat about is the glory of North America, the first real time that they made semifinals and the only time, because they were really fishing to say 2011 was the last time you made top 4. 2011, this barely was even an eSport. It wasn't even a competitive game. So 2018, Cloud9 and their run all the way to semifinals, an absolutely shocking run that they got to this point. Obviously, being in the group of death, first and foremost, they had both RNG, who were the consensus overall tournament favorites. Well, they proceeded to beat RNG once, force a tiebreaker that they were so close to taking down Uzi on Lucian in that one to go as the top seed from this group of death. They also had the defending world champions in Gen G, who had name changed from Samsung to Gen G. We know that's one of the worst Korean performances we've had on the international stage, that 1-5 group stage that Gen G got, one of those losses, and I think the only win courtesy of Cloud9. So, still gave them their only win, but proceeded to get through. And of course, the real surprise was eliminating the final team from the LCK, going 3-0 against the Africa Freaks. Pretty sure, unheard of, unprecedented, and still the last time a North American team was able to beat a LCK squad in a best-of-5 series. So really, Cloud9 single-handedly eliminated both Gen G and Africa. 2 out of the 3 LCK teams even taking part in the tournament were eliminated at the hands of Cloud9. And this is another case of maybe you prop them up even a little bit higher, but of course they ultimately get completely decimated by Fnatic in those semifinals in 3-0 fashion. But getting a North American team to a top 4 level at the World Championship was something that I don't think anyone would have predicted coming into that event, especially they weren't even the top seed from the LCS. That honor, of course, went to Team Liquid, who bowed out 3-3, and you'll notice there's no Team Liquid at Worlds performances that we're talking about on this list. No. Those never really came to fruition, but they did have that MSI one. But all credit in the world to Cloud9 for that performance at the 2018 World Championship. Next on the list, we're getting very recent, and even though they didn't go as far as Cloud9, you have to shout out the run that FlyQuest had in 2024. And yes, they did not make it to the semifinals. Yes, they got wins against PSG, and they qualified by beating Team Liquid, who's another LCS team. But let's be honest, those Team Liquid wins were incredibly dominant, first and foremost, in the way of FlyQuest. And secondly, they also managed to match up against, the best team from the LCK and the best team in the world, depending on what, side of things you were on. Of course, we had that Hanwha Life series where they pull out the Nunu and make it an oh-so-competitive 3-game set, taking a game off of Hanwha, and then, of course, the incredible back and forth Gen G series. I don't think people understand how rare it is to talk about an NA versus LCK best of 5 series at Worlds, and you're talking about it as one of the best competitive, most exciting series in the history of the World Championship, not just from 2024, but including other incredible series that we've had over the decades of the World Championship. That never happens. They're just 3-0, forgotten about, pages in history. That was not the case for FlyQuest, and a lot of that and why they deserve to be as high as 4 on this list is because they came in and played their own style. They shifted the meta to them, and the confidence that they played with gone were the old Team Liquid and TSM adages of just kind of cowering, shrinking, playing scared when they made it to the international stage. Didn't get any of that out of FlyQuest. A lot of that due credit because Bwipo and Inspired are absolute psychopaths on the Rift, and Masu, one of the best rookie runs, definitely from the LCS, but anyone internationally for FlyQuest. So going toe-to-toe with the 2 best teams in the LCK is more than enough for FlyQuest to make this list, even though they didn't make it all the way to that top 4. A top 8 finish, the only Western team making it to quarterfinals at that World Championship, deserves an absolute nod of approval from us and all LCS and Western fans worldwide. Now we're into the top 3, and I hope you enjoyed the run in North America, because unfortunately, the rest of the way, yeah, it's Europe. Yeah, you probably can predict what events, what teams we are talking about, and it starts with a run all the way to finals. We alluded to them in that Cloud9 2018 run. Yes, they were getting completely dismantled by Fnatic, which is why they are higher up on this list. They may not have been in the group of death to make it to top 8 that year like Cloud9 was, but they did have the eventual world champions in their group. And before we fast forward to them getting smacked, speed run through 3-0 in the finals at the hands of IG, remember in the group stage where it was Fnatic actually winning that pseudo best of 3. They split games and had to go to a tiebreaker to decide who finished first. And yes, it was Fnatic coming away with the win. Insane individual performances out of LeBlanc, or Caps on the LeBlanc, and of course Broxa has that infamously disgusting Lee Sin play against Ning and the boys on IG. But coming into this event, and especially after they won that tiebreaker, I think a lot of people were legitimately thinking that Fnatic should win the whole event, especially combined with this was the down year for the LCK. It very much was the LPL versus EU, because this is the year that G2 takes down RNG as well, and you can talk about, I mean, that's a G2 team we haven't referenced yet, but 2018 G2 with Perks as the mid laner, that upset against RNG is the only one, to me, you can put in the same conversation as the Team Liquid versus IG one from MSI. But we're not talking about G2 from 2018. We're talking about Fnatic. As soon as they became that top seed, I think people thought they could legitimately win the entire event. It was a shaky start to their series against EDG in the quarterfinals, but they eventually came through calm, cool, and collected to close things out in convincing fashion. I won't say dominant fashion because of that slow start, but convincing fashion at the very least before they would steamroll past Cloud9 and all the... That's really when the Jensen and Caps memes began, because he plays 3 straight Lysandra games. Caps completely styles on Cloud9 and Jensen as a whole before, again, they fall short ultimately in those grand finals. But the run up to that point, it felt like it was the first time there was legitimate faith and hope that a Western team could win the World Championship. Ever, really, at that point, since going back to Season 1 or Season 2. So, big ups to Fnatic for making those finals in 2018. Then we get to the Dynasty, the Legacy era, and G2 eSports. What can you say? I mean, 2020 G2 could even be slotted right here, and you could probably talk about, I mean, Caps has that incredible series against Gen G. They go up against Damwon in those semifinals as a rematch, again, in 2020, but it wasn't much of an actual rematch. They had some crazy games against Suning, but no, we're talking about the team that was so good, they make up 2 spots on this list. That is 2019 G2, and it's the mid-season invitational run that we have at number 2. And you might say, how do you have the one that they won as the second spot? Because yes, G2 did win at MSI, but this version of MSI was a little bit different. You know, it felt like the competition was even crazier at Worlds just because it was a bigger event. We're not docking points because there were only 6 teams at MSI, but we're giving more points for Worlds for having more squads. But G2 at this MSI was a bit of a mystery because they didn't look great in groups, even though they were 2-0 against SKT. They dropped a game to Team Liquid, dropped a game to Fangvu Buffalo, dropped both their games to IG, and you're going, okay, they look fine. I think it was 5-5. They ended up going into that knockout round, but the series against SKT, one of the best international series we've ever had, 5-game banger against this was the first look internationally of this new revamped SKT lineup with Khan and Teddy and Klid on the squad, and had just dominated Griffin in their spring finals. Faker's back at MSI. Everyone's expecting him to just go right back to his throne and reclaim that crown, but it was not meant to be. This was the series where baby Faker was shed from Caps and Claps was truly born in this set. The SKT series win is obviously the highlight of the whole event for G2, but it only gets more impressive when you go, well, yes, they beat Team Liquid. They didn't have to beat IG in a best of 5, but not only did they beat Team Liquid, this was an absolute embarrassment. You compare it to some of these other 3-0s. The Fnatic coup one in 2015, I said, it didn't really do it justice because it was competitive. This should have been a 5-0, how dominant G2 was. They obviously set the record for fastest international best of 5, but even that didn't do justice to just how big of a stomp beat down this series was against Team Liquid. These games were over by like 10 minutes, 3 times in a row. It almost, you really felt bad for Team Liquid even watching them having to play out a lot of these games. That's just how good, how terrifying this version of G2 was. And it only got more terrifying as we went later in the year. G2 still remains the closest team to ever completing that golden road, one single best of 5 away from winning both domestic titles, MSI, and a world championship. Their run at Worlds in 2019 was no shortage of incredible. I know they had an incredible start. They got a win against Griffin. They ended up losing the tiebreaker to Griffin to drop to a 2nd seed. and it didn't matter because they proceeded to take down Damwon. This was the young Damwon before they found that Worlds Dynasty level form out of Canyon and Showmaker, but nonetheless, it was a convincing 3-1 best-of-5 series win for a European team over an LCK team. Then they follow up with the rematch against SKT in semifinals, and yet again, deny Faker another chance at a world championship. I think this is one of 2 times that Faker hasn't made worlds when he qualifies for or hasn't made the world finals when he qualifies for the event. One of those at the hands of G2. They didn't even need 5 games to do it. They do it in game 4. And I think we all forget that heading into that finals showdown in Paris, home country advantage against FunPlus Phoenix, most people had G2 as the favorites. Why wouldn't you? They'd won every event that they had entered up to this point, and FPX, DoemB, and crew were still somewhat of a new commodity. A lot of the players on this team were not household names yet because LPL fan base wasn't even as big as it came to be a few years later. It was still just building up after IG had won, but G2 people were expecting to complete the Golden Road. Obviously, Tien decided to kick them back to Berlin to restart for LEC in 2020, but the run leading up to that point, and like this team was so dominant and so in the conversation for best team in the world for a Western squad. The top 20 player rankings for Worlds, they were all up there. It felt only fair that you do basically two different, first and second, the MSI run and the G2 run, because when you're looking at, performances for a single tournament, you can highlight both of them for G2 eSports and that 2019 legacy roster. I'm hard pressed to see a Western team ever reach the level that squad did. At the time, Perks and Caps were arguably the 2 best players in Europe. They had the incredible flexibility with the meta of being able to triple flex so many different champions. So the combination of the meta and the players that they had and the power level that they were at, I just don't see it being matched again by any Western squad. So we just sit and reminisce about the good old days of 2019 G2 eSports. But that is it today for League Unlocked. My name is Eric. Thank you all you beauties for hanging out with me today, and we will catch you on that flippity flip.